Well, let's start. Welcome to the special event organized by the university's Policy Engagement Network, UPEN. History Under Fire, the uses and abuses of historical evidence in conflict situations, the case of Ukraine. My name is Philip Murphy. I'm Director of History and Policy at the Institute of Historical Research, and I'm going to be chairing this session. We have four distinguished speakers who are going to be trying to tease out some of the implications of historical engagement around conflict. When nations go to war, they often do so on the basis of historical claims and justifications, and those are often repeated to maintain domestic and international support. They sometimes even determine how the conflicts end. So words that leave the historian, what a historian's professional and ethical obligations in these sorts of situations. How easy is it to talk to those in power and have one's voice both heard and understood. We have a fantastic panel today, and let me introduce the speakers in the order in which I'll introduce them. We have Serhiy Plokhy, who is Professor of Ukrainian History at Harvard University and Director of the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. His books include The Last Empire, The Final Days of the Soviet Union, The Gates of Europe, A History of Ukraine, and most recently, the Russo-Ukrainian War, The Return of History. With him, we have Margaret Macmillan, who is Emeritus Professor of History at the University of Toronto and Emeritus Professor of International History at Oxford University. She has been Provost of Trinity College, Toronto, and Warden of St. Anthony's College, Oxford. She's a prolific author on international history and has engaged directly in the subject under discussion here today in her 2008 book, The Uses and Abuses of History. We have Alison Edwards, who is lecturer in global histories at Bath Spa University. Alison is a specialist on Russia, on cultural militarism, patriotic education systems, and the use of history, memory, and commemoration. And finally, we have Christopher Finlay, who is Professor of Political Theory in the School of Government and International Affairs at the University of Durham. He's a specialist on the ethics of violence and armed conflict, and his books include Terrorism and the Right to Resist and Is Just War Possible, published in 2018. Now, I'm going to ask each of the speakers in turn to really introduce themselves, their work, and their relationship to the current conflict in Ukraine. And then I'm going to try and encourage a discussion between our panelists and then hopefully bring you all in with your questions. So please remain mute until you're called to ask a question. Please use the chat function to ask questions as we're going along. Don't feel you have to wait until the end. It's always nice and reassuring as chair to see questions starting to appear in the chat. And just to say, we will be recording this session, so please bear that in mind. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Serhiy to say a few words about his work and his relationship to Ukraine.
Thank you very much, Philip. Thank you for inviting me to be on this panel, and thank you for introduction. I want to start with agreeing with what you said, that uses and abuses of history is not something particularly new when it comes to wars, when it comes to justification of unjustifiable. But in my experience of looking at the wars of the 20th century, at least, I don't find any other war which would be so much wrapped into what I would call bad history. The all-out aggression against Ukraine started in February of 2022, but before that, a few months earlier, there was an entire essay on historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, published under the name of Vladimir Putin. I don't remember really other government leaders publishing entire essays justifying their attack. And the war is something that I discuss in my, this is the main topic of the book that was published last year. The title is The Russo-Ukrainian War, The Return of History. And when I talk about the return of history, I talk not, it's not a dig at Francis Fukuyama. I put a little bit different meaning in the return of history, in a sense that I think that me personally and many people that I have been in touch with over not just years, but decades, somehow believed on subconscious level that the history of the 20th century with unprovoked aggressions, annexation of territories, the conventional wars on the level of the Korean War or even World War II, that they're in the past. And certainly in that sense, history, the most horrible parts maybe of history of the 20th century are back with this war. So that's one meaning that I was putting in that term. But I'm also trying to discuss the, among other things, the historical or pseudo-historical claims that are made by aggressor in this war. And it's very interesting for me as a historian. Again, it's horrible as a citizen of the world, as someone who comes from Ukraine, who has relatives and friends in Ukraine. It's a horrible exercise to look into those claims. But for as a historian, it's really a very interesting exercise, because what you see in the claims made in the 21st century are very much the roots of the beliefs, historical myths in particular, that comes from the 19th century. And first of all, I have in mind Putin's claim about Russians and Ukrainians being one and the same people, which is part of the Russian imperial thinking and Russian ideology of the late 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. So I call this war a 19th century war in terms of ideology. And when I talk about ideology, I mean also as part of it, a historical mythology, a 20th century war in terms of tactics, and the mythology of World War II and a so-called Great Patriotic War on the Russian side plays a very important role, again, in attempt to mobilize the Russians, to justify the war to the international community. So 19th century war in terms of ideology, 20th century war in terms of tactics, and 21st century war in terms of technology that is being used on the battlefield. So it's a case where history wasn't used just to justify the attack, but continues to be used and abused in the course of the war. I just want to end by pointing anyone who believes that the extension of NATO somehow turned out to be the most important the cause or trigger for this war, watch and listen to the most recent interview by Tucker Carlson with Vladimir Putin, where Carlson comes to Moscow to get all sorts of explanations about traditional values, whatnot. Instead, he is treated for 30 minutes of history lecture, bad history lecture. So that's how history and misreading of history continues to be really very, very important in this war. So I will stop here, and I really look forward to the comments of my colleagues on the panel.
Thank you very much. Can I hand over to Margaret at this stage, please?
Thank you, Sergey, because you laid out very well what I think also about this. I agree with you, except I'm not sure I can take your advice to watch the Tucker Carlson interview. Our life is too short, and it was so painful. I've read, I've watched bits of it. I'm not sure I can bear to watch it again. As you were talking, I was reflecting just how important history has become, particularly, I think, in secular societies, which have lost faith, perhaps in organized religion, which have lost faith in their own leaders. There's a degree of cynicism about our elites today, which I think is very pronounced. And I notice more and more that people refer to history as if it is some sort of impartial tribunal, some sort of impartial judge sitting there. Whenever I hear people say they want to be on the right side of history, it worries me, because there is no right side of history. History is what happened in the past. We can make our own moral judgments on it, but there isn't a judge sitting there saying, yes, you were right and they were wrong, or you will be right and they will be wrong. I think we place far too much authority in history. It should be a guide. It should be a way of helping us to think about the world. It should be a way of helping us to understand others and to understand ourselves. But it should not be something that we think is without question. History must always be questioned. And I speak as an historian. I've spent most of my life, as we all do in history, challenging the ideas of others and being challenged myself. I've written about the beginnings of wars. I've written about the ends of wars. And most recently, I wrote about the bit that happens in between the war itself. And of course, when we look at war, and you can see this very clearly in the Ukraine war, you see just how much history can come into it. As Sergey mentioned, wars are used to create national myths, and they're increasingly used, history is used in war as justification, not just for fighting, but as justification for the claims that are going to be made afterwards, claims to territory. Again, I think we used to accept up until the 19th century that if you conquered a bit of land, as long as you could hang on to it, you kept it. And that's what usually was recognized in peace treaties or at peace congresses. But by the 19th century, as we got more participatory societies, we got the growth of nationalism, more and more history began to be used to claim territory. That this bit of territory has always been ours. The French tried to claim the Rhineland after the First World War, ignoring the fact or explaining away the fact that most of the people in the Rhineland spoke German and not French. The French said, nevertheless, they have a joie de vivre and an appetite for fine wine, which Germans just simply don't have, and therefore the people in the Rhineland must be German. And we see it today. We see it in Putin's very bad essay, which if I'd been grading, I would have probably given a D- to, because I'm kind and I don't like failing students. But this nonsense about Ukraine always spiritually being one part of Russia, and his nonsensical use of history, I think, is very much, I'm afraid, what we're going to get more and more of. And there are a great many areas in the world in which history can be used very badly. The final way, I think, in which history is used is it is used to describe the ends of wars. It's used to talk about victories. It's used to perhaps develop a sense of grievance. And there again, it can be very dangerous, as we saw with Germany after the First World War, when many in Germany became convinced that they hadn't really lost the war, that they'd been stabbed in the back at home by traitorous left-wingers and so on. I think our job, and it probably feels like Sisyphus rolling his stone up the hill, is to challenge this. We have to do this repeatedly and to challenge bad history, to point out where it's bad. Because if we don't, that bad history will go rampaging around, causing all sorts of trouble and misery.
Thank you very much indeed, Margaret. Can I move on now to Alison, please?
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me today to participate in this wonderful panel. There's so much that I can pick just from what Sergey and Margaret have said, and I don't quite know where to start. Possibly the best place for me to start is kind of where I come from in terms of the uses and abuses of history. And my particular focus is on Russia itself and how history is used and abused, particularly for a youth audience. So I focus primarily on youth militarization, patriotic education, particularly how history is framed within that, within formal and non-formal educative circumstances. So I don't just look at schools and textbooks, but also patriotic military youth groups as well that sit outside, and also the insertion of history in popular culture, for example, aimed at youth. And one of the things that kind of really interested me from what Margaret and Serhi were referring to is how history has been used as justification, also as claims to territory, for example, but also I think in the case of youth, claims to identity and ancestry. For me, I see this particularly in youth militarization, in the way that the youth are referred to as heirs of victory. For example, so those who will be taking on and picking up the victory of those who fought in the past, their grandfathers, their great-grandfathers, particularly in reference to the Great Patriotic War, but there are instances as well in which wars of the past, wars that span as far as Peter the First, for example, when they're spoken about in Russian textbooks, it's never really about the people who fought at the time, but they're referred to as your ancestors. So there's that link there. We can talk about what version of history Putin thinks is true. I'm still trying to grapple what that actually is. What I can say, it's all representations of Russia's past, which is positive, and then therefore muting kind of negative depictions of the past. But this falsification of history, or this claims to falsification of history that Putin and people within his vicinity make, distortions and falsifications of the past from them, who are usually he's referring to the West. He also considers not just as a destruction of Russian history, but a destruction of the Russian state itself. So he brings the two together. And so through that, what he does is, and what others as well, so in the school system, for example, is that they keep the truth of what has happened in Russia's past is very vague, so that they're able to attach it to different moments, different things that are happening within the world today, and they're able to then easily adapt it to those different moments. One of the things I'm particularly interested in is not necessarily what the narratives are, but how they are being taught. So Russian youth, for example, are being asked to participate in activities that get them to embody particular pasts. So they'll act, for example, they'll do reenactments of famous wars, they will dress up in military gear, they will have to, for example, stand in their school yards holding flags, the St. George's ribbon, which is the orange and black ribbon that's used to commemorate Victory Day, predominantly, and they'll hold it in like a Z or a V formation. And the kind of framework in which scholars have referred to this as is militainment. So a way of making the military and things about the military interesting and entertaining for youth. And usually when we talk about that, we're talking about a very shallow engagement with that type of history. We kind of, as outsiders, we mock it. We kind of say, well, how on earth can people kind of engage with this ridiculous form of history by, for example, dressing up buggies in as a tank on Victory Day, for example. But one of the things I've come to see, particularly through the concept of heroism and heroic acts of the past, is that militainment simply acts as a doorway for deeper engagement with this type of history and with ideologies that are attached to this, such as militarism, for example. And what youth are being told today is to see the military and military glory as a necessary aspect of the Russian state. To me, it adds and asks us questions about what the post-Putin world looks like, considering I get asked a lot what that could be. And for me, a kind of key constituency to focus on in that is the youth. And I feel like I'm going to stop there and hopefully add something a bit later on. Thank
you very much indeed. And finally, over to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, and thanks very much for inviting me onto the panel, Philip. I'm really grateful to be part of it. So where I come from, as Philip said earlier, is not history. I'm not a historian, though my training was originally in history, but political theory or political philosophy, if you like. And much of my work over the last 15 or 20 years has been in how political philosophy might engage with the theme of violence and how we think about ethical questions arising from the seemingly inevitable use of violence in politics. So I was having to think quite hard about what contribution I can make in a panel like this, because it's not a panel about the ethics of war as such, And, you know, if the major theory for thinking about the ethics of war is just war theory, I'm not quite sure. I don't think just war theory speaks directly to the ethical questions we've raised here. So I was trying to think where else one might turn to for that. Thinking about, as historians, good or bad, what the ethical implications are of engaging in, you know, pursuing impact or trying to influence policy, shaping public opinion, and so on. And so what I thought, I came up with 3 thoughts that I'll offer, and we can see if they're of any use. The first thought was, I thought for historians, good and bad, I mean, historians like Putin, historians like the historians on this panel, for those engaging in this kind of work, I think the question of ethics seems to arise to me in particular for the very Weberian reason that if you engage in trying to influence politics, you find yourself very close to like what Max Weber calls the characteristic means of politics, physical violence. And I mean, there are plenty of reasons to doubt Weber's characterization of politics in general, that politics is commonly or typically identified with violence. But at the present time, it's hardly going to be doubted. If you try to influence policy on Ukraine, if you're trying to have some kind of causal salience for good or ill, you are potentially going to shape the permutations of violence on the battlefield. Arguments about supply will extend the war. Arguments about pursuing peace at all costs will shorten the war, but intensify violence perhaps on the Russian side and so on. So, you know, if we are serious about pursuing influence, if we're serious about engaging with policymakers, for example, or indeed shaping public opinion around the war, I think it does put us in that sort of Weberian space where there is a risk, because there's a risk with any such influence. It's going to lead to consequences you didn't anticipate, however good your scholarship might be and however much integrity you bring to that. So that was my first thought. The second thought was about how historians might have that kind of causal salience. I think there are 2 ways in which that seems to be happening, particularly in relation to the present conflict. And one is through the sort of advice for princes model, the kind of looking at precedents, looking at analogies, looking into the past to find instruction as to how policymakers can engage with the present crisis. So looking at World War I to see how things can go badly, or the Cuban Missile Crisis to see how nuclear catastrophe can be forestalled and so on. So that's one way in which we can do it. And I think that's maybe that perhaps brings its own risks. I mean, any kind of advice potentially implicates you on a decision that might be made that could have consequences. But I think, as the speakers all so far have indicated, that probably history's salience in the present conflict is even more powerful at the level of interpretation. And because interpretation is just so close to thinking about values and thinking about the ethics of the conflict, how you interpret the Ukraine conflict, how you interpret Ukraine itself, its past, its trajectory, its potential futures, is really integral to how you respond to the invasion and how you think of it in moral terms. It affects how you think about, as just war theorists would say, just cause, about the ends of the conflict, about what values it is being fought for. That in turn will affect how you think about proportionality, which will affect how you think about whether there's, you know, whether the Ukrainian armed forces will run out of moral road, as it were, and end up, whether the cost becomes too high at some point. I'm not suggesting that it will, but that's those historical interpretations, it seems to me, very much drive the way in which we think about ethics. And I think ethicists can't really do any serious work about Ukraine without directly engaging with historians. Sorry, I better move on. The last thought was just, well, what do we do with that? You know, what ethical guidance is there? And I thought, again, Weber is quite suggestive on this. I'm thinking, of course, about his famous lecture, Politics as a Vocation. If you're engaging in politics, Weber says, it is not enough to follow your sort of core moral values or convictions to ensure that your conscience is clear, that you have behaved scrupulously. You must also attend to the consequences of what you've done. And attend it, as he calls this, the ethics of responsibility. Thinking about the consequences of what you've done may be in tension with, you know, the core values he thinks in politics. You know, your sort of the ethical boundaries you wish to respect, you may have to violate those if you're engaged in political action directly. I think for historical scholars, there's a question of tact here. There's a question of thinking about and building into decisions about interventions in the public sphere, thinking about the consequences of what different views might have if they are taken up by the public and when they're taken up by policymakers. because even the most conscientious scholarship can lead into unintended consequences, can get dragged into political decision-making that could entail risks that you didn't anticipate, but that Weber would say you need nevertheless to regard as your own. You need to take responsibility for what those consequences might be. What that means in practical terms for historians, I perhaps should hand back to the historians. Maybe it doesn't mean anything, but if it means something, maybe it's something we can discuss. Thanks.
That's really interesting, Chris. And I think Chris has laid down a series of challenges, which I'd be very happy, very interested to hear the other panelists responding to. And just maybe to frame that in a slightly different way as well. At the start of Sergei's brilliant book on the Russo-Ukrainian war, he talks very movingly about hearing the news of the 2022 invasion while he was in Vienna, and the shock of it, and how he responds to it. And he considers some of the challenges of becoming directly involved. And there's this lovely passage, he writes, "Eventually I convinced myself that, to rephrase Winston Churchill, historians are the worst interpreters of current affairs except everyone else." Sergei, do you want to expand a bit on that and maybe respond to some of Chris's points and challenges?
Sure. Yes, I was doing something that I don't recommend doing anybody who doesn't have a tenure. So as a historian, I decided to write on contemporary developments, and one of the reasons why I eventually started doing that, I believe that there was a lot of bad history around, and at least what I can do, I can set a record straight, which then led also to trying to frame in historical terms the news that were coming in the year 2022 and 2023. So it was a very challenging, but also very interesting exercise for me as a historian. I also acquired and developed a much more respect for the early chroniclers who were in charge of putting chronologies together and deciding which facts mattered, which didn't, as they were happening in front of their eyes. So I learned a lot about profession of a historian, but one thing that I really still can't answer to myself is how, as a historian, you deal really with the bad history and uses and abuses of history, because engaging directly with that history on a certain level provides a justification. So on a certain level provides a legitimacy to argument coming from the other side. And very often you can get a reaction. Okay, so this is one point, and this is one view, and this is another, and probably they're both valued. So I decided to write about history, not directly being involved with those who really perpetuate bad history and mythology. But I don't think that I fully satisfied with at least the response that I came upon. That's certainly something that I'm still struggling with. I absolutely agree with Margaret and Christopher. This is this is a responsibility us historians as citizens. But I don't think that we are fully ready to face that responsibility. Or at least I'm still trying to find the best way how to approach this. Thank you.
And can I mean, really just going back to Chris's point, historians, scholars, we're not particularly powerful people in society. When we engage with people who do have power, are there dangers there for our integrity as scholars?
Well, there is a danger. There is clearly danger because you take certain position, right? And that's to a degree can be challenging for a historian who, at least in my case, the approach was, okay, you have to be balanced, you have to present all points of view. And there, especially if you're writing an op-ed, there is no just space to write a historiographic introduction.
Yeah.
It's about having an opinion and expressing it as strongly as possible. And that, on a certain level, goes against the way how we have been trained. And also the question about the responsibility. In every other profession that I know of, let's talk about medical doctors, it comes as a given that whatever you do, whatever decision you make, it can bring positive and it can bring negative consequences. And people are trained that way. People live with that, dealing with that emotionally on the ethical level and otherwise. So it looks like we are outliers here compared to other profession. Bus driver, turning left or turning right. Yeah, so these people are making these choices on the not just daily basis, hourly basis, but we are not prepared to do that. For us, this is a challenge. And again, that's something to think about.
Thank you very much. Margaret, can I ask you to come in and maybe respond to some of Chris's points, but also maybe, I think Sergei laid down a bit of a challenge himself in his opening comments about how the Ukraine conflict is remarkable in its use of bad history. Do we have other examples of bad history in conflicts that you've written about?
Sorry, I was muted. I apologize.
Yeah.
I was just dithering, trying to think of other examples of bad history in conflicts. And well, I mean, Nazi ideology was based both on bad biology and bad history, and the idea that the Nazis had and Germany had the right to try and conquer the whole of Europe, or that the Sudetenlands of Czechoslovakia were historically German, which in fact they weren't. They'd never been part of Germany. They'd always been part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So yes, I think there are many examples of bad history. I think we have to challenge it. People may not want to listen to us. And I've often thought we're like the boring people at a dinner party and someone is telling a funny story about missing the bus to Clapham. And we interrupt and say, no, that bus doesn't go to Clapham. You know, that I think this is in a way what we have to do. But I think we have to be careful not to speak with an authority on areas that we don't really know. I mean, I always find it, I always get annoyed when I see lawyers, for example, speaking out on issues which they're not actually expert on, but they're using their professional authority to claim a sort of status for themselves. But I think we should try and communicate with the public. I think we can have opinions as long as we make it clear that those are our opinions. Whether we change people's minds, I'm not sure, but I think we have to keep trying. I mean, we're living in a world in which relativity and subjectivity have gained tremendous influence. I mean, how often do we hear people saying, well, I don't care what you say, it's my truth. And, you know, these are people who would not get on an airplane where the pilot says, it's my truth that I know how to fly this plane, trust me. But we seem to believe in sort of the autonomy of the individual to make up his or her own mind. And this, I think, can be dangerous. I mean, we can defer too much to those with learning and authority, but I think there are times when we really have to respect that. As far as Ukraine goes, I mean, I've been reflecting as Sergei and the others were talking, just how much we've allowed history to dominate the conversation about whether Russia should have invaded or not. It seems to me that whatever the history, even if Putin's history was right, the fact is that people living in Ukraine here and now don't want to be part of Russia, and that self-determination is actually probably more important than history here. But we do, I think, as I say, give this particular authority to history. And if we want a bad example of the misuse, one example of the bad use of history closer to home, during the Brexit campaign, when I was in the UK, the use that was made of 1940, when it was said Britain stood alone, we've always stood alone. Well, I can tell you, speaking as a Canadian, and I share this view was shared by my Australian friends as well, Britain was not alone in 1940. It had the whole empire with it, and there were a great many of us from the empire in the UK supporting the UK. I'm not sure that's answered your question, but there's so many things that you and the others have said that I'm trying to think of all the things I want to say, but I'll stop now.
Thank you very much. Alison, would you like to come in and again, maybe thinking about some of the points that Chris has raised about actually engaging with the policymaking process through your expertise on Russia and what's happening in Russia at the moment?
Yeah, I think I can add a few points, although probably somewhat briefly, because I'm someone in my early career, so I haven't had as much or as many opportunities to kind of engage with policymakers. What I would say, however, is that I think it's important that we are involved in the process, but within a group of others. And this is kind of one of the points I wanted to also bring from what Margaret and Serhii were saying about us having authority voices on some of these conversations. As historians, we know that we can't paint the whole picture because we are bringing our own perspectives to the discussion, and we are bringing our points of views. And one of the things that I have seen grow over the last 2 years, I would say in particular, are the growth of these forms of discussions like this panel here, where more voices are coming together to problematize and to talk about these issues. And I think that this is certainly a thing that should happen in policy circles, where you're engaging with multiple people of different expertise and backgrounds to talk about these issues. In terms of the youth, they have not appeared as much on, or at least in conversations in policy circles, from my understanding, from the outside, from my understanding, sitting on the outside looking in. And actually, as one of the points I raised earlier, is many of the questions that policymakers are asking is what happens next? What happens next? What happens after Putin? And yet we're still not even centering, but we're not giving youth an agency, or at least bringing them in as an agency of topic in this conversation. And I think we need to do that more seriously.
Alison, there was a term that you used, which I love, militainment, and I kind of underlined it. And I wonder whether there's a problem here, that in terms of public engagement around history, it seems to be, I mean, the easiest area of history, it seems, to engage public attention and enthusiasm is military history, is the history of wars. And Margaret talked about how, you know, the Battle of Britain and 1940 were used in the Brexit campaign. Is there a danger here that, you know, we kind of persuade people that their history really begins and ends with military history, and that this then provides a kind of an incentive for rulers and people like Putin to use the military as a way of kind of further, as he would see it, in enhancing national unity and identity.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll expand on that answer though, because I could just say yes and be like, there we go, done. But no, absolutely. And I think particularly the Second World War features not just in Russia's education, but across the board. It's a pivotal part as well of what we're taught in British education in schools, for example. But I think in terms of the Second World War in the Russian case study, for example, militarism is, I'm going to probably sound like I'm generalizing. I'm not intending to generalize the Russian population on this, but in educational textbooks, for example, and in the educational sphere in Russia, in these history educational textbooks, military history takes up a vast proportion of each of these textbooks. So I surveyed a lot of textbooks from the 1990s, for example, for my thesis, where I was looking at cultural militarization during that time. But within that, it shows the trajectory, or at least the long use of military history as a way of forming a part of, what I was referring to earlier is a part of Russian identity, but also kind of a part of their ancestry. You know, you are in a long line of either victors, or kind of relating to what Margaret was saying earlier, you are in a line of people who've struggled during very vulnerable times and have then been either victorious or have remained suspicious of that kind of world around you, that dangerous worldview that these narratives also kind of perpetuate as well. So there is an absolute danger of military remaining a kind of a core point of people's history and history education, but I don't see that changing anytime soon.
Thank you very much. And Chris, would you like to respond to the comments of the other panelists in terms of the issues that you raised in your initial comments.
Yeah, thanks very much, Philip. Yeah, I mean, it just the shape of the comments, I think, do speak, I think, to the kind of problem that Max Weber thought there was. You know, on the one side, you've got the question of integrity and what happens to your integrity when you engage in politics. One danger is that it vitiates that integrity. You find yourself being corralled into a partisan mode that sits ill with your scholarly values. But on the other side, I think Weber would also emphasize that having only, you know, insisting on your integrity without attending to the, you know, what's actually happening politically, sort of overemphasizing your integrity can also be risky. So if you know, if you're following a kind of Mearsheimer's kind of more symmetrical way of looking at the world, and you take that into a policy context, it may make sense in terms of your scholarship, but actually what will happen if people take that forward into policy could lead to results that are, you know, maybe unintended or maybe not. In his case, I'm not sure, but that, you know, you do have to think about what happens next. I like Margaret's thought that maybe there's, on the one hand, there's, and Alison too, that on the one hand, there's this really important involvement that the historian ought to have in shaping public opinion, perhaps, or shaping debates about policy and so on, shaping the intellectual context. But also that on the other side, there can be too much history, or we can over-historicize certain problems. I don't think it should be, it's not too much history, but just there's a space within which we need to think about the Ukraine case, maybe in terms of just war ethics or the ethics of violence, in terms of self-determination and the kind of political values that political philosophers are interested in, to think about what is this war about now. Regardless of where we've come from, Ukrainians clearly wish to resist. What are they resisting for? And what are the ethical ramifications of that? You know, what does this mean for other states that are supplying them? So some of it, history, I think, will inform the ethical judgments, but it's not the only dimension here. I think ethics, or, you know, just war thinking, for example, has a significant part to play here too. It's not going to do that well if it's not engaging with history. So there's also a kind of interdisciplinarity to I think to thinking about this case in particular. I was also struck by it's again quite Weberian thought that actually defending good history against bogus history can lend credence to the bogus history, can make it seem like there are, you know, two equally valid perspectives, both of which must be represented on the BBC in order to fulfill impartiality requirements. You know, that you can, it's the irony, the sort of historical irony is what's central to that way of thinking about political action. There will always be consequences you didn't want and didn't anticipate, and you need to sort of think about how that game is going to play out. But of course, as Sergei said, you know, you also have to live with consequences. It doesn't mean you can't run away from them, you can't control them, you're not fully accountable for them. It's just that you have to be prepared for the fact that there may be consequences. Maybe it's a psychological point as much as anything else.
Yeah, I mean, there are already some interesting questions in the chat, and I'll try and bring them all in. There's a long question by Ahmed, but it sort of relates to, I think, what Chris was talking about just then. And it's going back to this Tucker Carlson interview. And clearly, you know, the interview is used as an opportunity to cherry pick history, Ahmed says, to present history in a particular way. But then we all end up talking about the Tucker Carlson interview, and we then engage with it. And meanwhile, the bad history enters the public consciousness. So are we in danger through engaging in actually giving these sorts of arguments a false credence? I mean, Serhii, what do you think about that?
Well, there is certainly a responsibility of journalists on a certain level, but we on many levels we live through a crisis of journalism, or at least the standards that existed in the past somehow don't apply today anymore. But it is our certain responsibility to point to the cases where really the journalists provide a platform for disseminating a very biased view and in our opinion bad history. So that has to be stated. And another again way to deal with that issue is really engage with public. So engage not so much with whoever is producing these ideas and views, that there is no hope of changing anything there, but being engaged with public. This is a very important issue. The question is, once we do that, we are in danger, as Margaret suggested, of crossing this line between us as professionals. We all have our limits in terms of how much history we study, how much history we understand, how much history we can explain, and much broader questions and demands that the public can have. And again, that's where we have find a balance. Moving into the public intellectual sphere without losing professionalism and finding the way to engage with the public. The event like that, it's of course one way to do that. Writing for a broader audience, and that's where I really look at profession of history in UK as example, at least for me personally, and also for historians writing in North America and also in parts of Europe. So I think that we all outside of UK have something to learn from our colleagues in United Kingdom.
Thank you very much indeed. My UPEN colleague Will Pryor has posed a question in the chat. Will, would you like to come in and ask the question yourself? Just unmute yourself, otherwise I can read it out.
Ask it better. Yeah. It was
yeah.
It was really, I've heard researchers in different disciplines say that one of the biggest impacts they have on policy is actually through their teaching, not through their research. But aside from the books being out there, I speak as a recovering policy professional. Often I would find myself in a situation where I could grab as many books as were available or recommended to me, but there's a certain jeopardy in reaching out to someone who can perhaps in a propositional way suggest different ways of thinking about and framing something, because we appreciate policy is not necessarily made in the UK's case in Lord Cameron's head. It's made in lots of other heads as well, and I wonder if there's anything collectively that we can do about that to make it easier for them to engage and to make, I was going to say ourselves, make historians, make it easier for them to be useful in this way.
Margaret, would you like to come in on that?
Yes, I think what we could do more of, but it would have to be politicians and other leaders who want to do it, is effectively have seminars. We don't just have to give people book lists. You often learn a great deal and have your ideas challenged in conversation and discussion. And one of the things that concerns me is how rarely politicians and other leaders have the time to do this. I mean, the demands on them now are so great, and they're constantly going to this meeting and that meeting. I mean, I had a meeting with on Zoom, but there were several of us with Canadian deputy ministers, which are your equivalent of the permanent undersecretaries, in which we talked for an hour and a half about Ukraine, what it meant. And I think the feedback we got was they found it useful because we were talking among ourselves and putting different points of view. The more that can happen, we all know that if you go to any sort of meeting, often the most interesting bits are when you're all having coffee together or going out to dinner, but it's the group discussion. And I think if that could become more something that happens more often and is not seen as just a lecture or a waste of time, I think it is actually really important for leaders to be able to step back and look more broadly at what's happening and ask themselves questions and understand some of the questions that are out there being asked.
And would you have particular advice for historians early in their careers for how most effectively to speak to policymakers?
Well, I think it's very important to begin with to learn to write very clearly. There's a tendency in universities to develop special languages for subjects. It's most pronounced, well, sciences need special languages. They need special ways of describing things. Social sciences want to be like scientists, and I think they've somehow adopted the mode. I'm sorry, I hope does political philosophy fit into social sciences or humanities? Anyway, I'm sorry, Chris, if I'm being rude. But I think that, I think we have to be careful not to talk only to ourselves and not to look inward. That doesn't mean dumbing down, but it does mean trying to be as clear as possible. I think we're paid by the public. I think we have an obligation to make what we're doing comprehensible to the public without making it oversimplified. But I think it's very important. So if we learn to write and to speak clearly, again, I think that's where lecturing is maybe not for the students, but for us is incredibly good job training, because you learn to speak to a room full of people and you hope keep their interest. And so the more they can do, and of course with younger historians, they also have the possibility of tweeting and doing podcasts. I've never got into that, but it should be something that they should consider.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We've still got time for more questions. There's some in the chat. So if people want to come in, just write something in the chat. Say, Philip, please bring me in. There's a question from Karen Sayer. And Karen says, thank you for the fascinating presentations. Should we be concerned that these sorts of history, which admittedly were also present in the Soviet Union, seem to be rising, the use of bad history, coincidentally, when we in the UK and USA are facing a particularly challenging period to professional historical research in the universities? Alison, would you like to come in on that?
Yes, yeah, of course. I think there are different subjects, of course, in which we can talk about when we're talking about the UK and the USA. Like, for example, the way in which the UK talks about empire, the way that America, for example, talks about slavery in its history curriculum as well. And a lot of these have kind of, at least the politicized discussions we see today have come out from social movements like Black Lives Matter, decolonizing the curriculum, that are asking for kind of a greater extension of what we know about that time period by centering the voices of those who are marginalized or who remain kind of invisible in history. So what's happening in Russia now is not unique to Russia, but and every country will do it depending on what history they feel kind of forms a major part of their being, their essence, their identity. It is especially challenging when a lot of these conversations are politicized and have been kind of taken up by the government. I see this more so in the US with, for example, discussions around critical race theory, for example, in the political sphere, and kind of how they being the government, I would say, different government figures, for example, are trying to have a greater say on what universities are able to teach around these topics.
Alison, can I just ask you another question? We've been very much kind of focused on the West in our discussion at the moment, but what about the historical voices from Russia itself? I mean, are you in touch with Russian historians? Is it still possible to say something of value as an intellectual in Russia? Is there a kind of distant movement there which is trying to make important interventions?
So there are a few historians who have stayed in Russia. I also engage with people who work in the international relations and political science, because that's kind of where I sit as well. I sit on the boundaries, and they're also writing about the abuses and uses of history.
Yeah.
Except a lot of those now are writing about it in a way that doesn't necessarily bring down the Kremlin or speak against the Kremlin, because they're still working in those Russian higher kind of education institutions. Yeah. So I'd say it's very much the same. What I would highlight is that there's kind of even greater danger to marginalize the voices of ethnic minorities in history in Russian education instances. Yeah, hopefully I've answered that.
So, yeah, thank you very much. So, I mean, Serhiy, are you in touch with Russian historians based in Russia? Is it still possible to have any degree of kind of freedom of thought or expression?
Yes, I'm in touch, and it becomes increasingly more and more difficult to really have some space where you can write and research and teach without being affected by what is happening around you. Most of people whom I knew actually left Russia after February 2022. Those who stayed, one thing that I hear is that those of them of an older generation who remember Soviet times, lived through the perestroika and then 1990s and later, found themselves in a little bit privileged position in a sense that they already have a mode of operating in some form of totalitarian society. So it's sort of internal immigration into the themes and topics that are less affected by politics of today. That's the techniques that had been developing certainly through the 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s, which means that for some period of time, the profession can somehow preserve itself and survive to a degree. But it's the question of how long this really totalitarian assault on history outside of Russia and especially inside of Russia will last, how long it will go, because the new generation of historians that is being trained under these circumstances, even by the people who really don't share those ideas, but have to teach those ideas, that generation will be again very, very different. It will be lost generation in more than one way. And if I can also add to the discussion that we had earlier, and Margaret mentioned that meeting with the policymakers, advisors in the seminar setting, it's very useful for them. I had a couple of experiences like that, and I can tell that it was very useful for me as well. So I think that as the result of these meetings and conversations with the practitioners, I became a better historian by better understanding certain things. So it's basically a two-way street where we can benefit as well from that sort of context.
That's really interesting. Would you like to give an example of that, of something that became clearer in your mind through talking to policymakers?
One thing that it's very clear for me is that, or became clear, is that in the world of governments and decision making, very often people are running from one crisis to another. And there is very little time really to think about that strategically, to think long term. We often think about Kissinger and Brzezinski, and to a degree they were exceptions. And one of people in the US government told me that, you know what, we don't have really time to read those position papers, but things that we learned as university students, or when we were in our master's or graduate or PhD programs, or things that we really get as the result of that sorts of meetings, they really stay with us. And they have this ability to influence our decisions much more than a policy paper written on specific topic. So that's my understanding. I got a better understanding of how that world works. But in terms of what I learned, it was a very practical things on the developments of the last 2 years or 3 years of what was happening in the 1990s. So that for me became sort of an oral history exercise that again certainly enriched me, and I hoped also influenced in a positive way my text and my teaching.
Thank you very much indeed. That's really interesting because of course UPEN and History and Policy are committed to the idea that academics should engage with policymakers, but it's important to see this, as you say, as a two-way process, and we benefit as academics from having that dialogue, as well as, I think, having something to say to policymakers. Thank you so much. We've got to 3 o'clock British Summer Time. We have to wind up. It's been incredibly rich discussion. Thank you so much to our 4 panelists, to Serhii, to Margaret, to Alison, to Chris, and to all of you for joining us and for some really penetrating questions. So I hope you've enjoyed this. Thank you all very much indeed. And please stay in touch with UPenn and with History and Policy. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks.